And this panel is the question of the proper role of government in science and technology. So we know innovation is a key to economic growth, which is key to making sure that the world doesn't only fight over a static set of resources. We promote it through a combination of government and industry resources channeled through a large number of institutions, incentives, to try to encourage all those institutions to conduct research, other incentives to move research from the lab to the real world, and more. And now we might be on the brink of a radical increase in government spending on R&D, and perhaps changes in how money is spent through the US Innovation and Competition Act. I believe that's what it's called at the moment. And we're going to talk about a lot of this today. Let me quickly introduce everybody, and then we will start. I will just go in alphabetical order. First we have, there is Ashish Arora, who is the Senior Associate Dean for Strategy and Rex Adams Professor of Business Administration at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke. His research focuses on the economics of technology and technical change, focusing on technology, including industries such as software, biotech, chemicals, the economics of information security, and the role of patents and licensing in promoting technology startups. We have Linda Cohen here in person. And Linda is a professor of economics and law, emeritus? Emeritus, did you tell me? Yeah, emeritus, at UC Irvine. Her research is in innovation policy with an emphasis on energy, using economic and political models to analyze how certain institutions affect technological innovation. Linda also did a lot of work with my advisor, Roger Knoll, so I did a lot of work with Linda when I was a grad student, and I'm very happy to have her here. We have Kaye Feeling, who is Dean of the Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts at the Georgia Institute of Technology, formerly the chair of the School of Public Policy in Georgia Tech. She specializes in science and innovation policy, the public value of research expenditures, and the underrepresentation of women and minorities in STEM fields and the workforce. And we have Prem Natarajan, is vice president in Amazon's Alexa unit, where he leads the natural understanding organization within Alexa AI. And before Amazon, he was senior vice dean of engineering in the Viterbi School of Engineering, executive director of the Information Sciences Institute, and research professor of computer science with distinction. Okay, let us jump right into it. So the big question is, how do you expect R&D spending to change over the next few years? What is going to happen with this act? Will we see radical changes? What's on the table right now? Who wants to take that? Go ahead.
Okay, I'll talk and see if it's my job. So there's a bunch of acts that are making their way through Washington, and I have no idea which of them are going to pass. I think that the theme of a lot of them is throw money at a problem. And presumably we'll discuss this somewhat. Throwing money is an interesting concept when it comes to R&D. Sometimes it seems to be necessary, but it is very rarely sufficient, so we'll hear more about that. From what I've seen of these bills, and again, it's very difficult to know what's going on with them, I would say we're moving from the way government talks about the money, at least, is moving from the idea that government is supposed to be doing something about market failures to a mindset of government has a very active role in promoting innovation in the country. And a lot of the new initiatives that are coming up in these bills strike me as what you might call research on applications or applied research, something along those lines. The idea being not only to promote innovation, but actually to promote products, industries, companies actually doing stuff, and that it takes more than initial funding in order to do that. I'd be very interested in hearing what the other panelists think about this.
Well, actually, so let's go back to one of the first things you said, which was some of it involves throwing money at a problem. So in one case, at least, with vaccines, that seems to have actually done something, right? Ashish, I know you've in particular worked on pharmaceuticals. What do you have to say about, what do you think about the way that we encouraged vaccine development during the pandemic?
Well, so the vaccine development is a really interesting case study. For one, it happened well before warp speed. DARPA, for example, was funding nucleic acid-based vaccine, not just research, but development back in 2010. And NIH was funding research in nucleic acid-based vaccines well before that, or along with that. So we had the scientific basis for that. Then we had what I think is another neglected aspect of policy, which is the demand side, procurement. And we've all talked about that, the sort of the guaranteed demand for companies to say, if you make it, we buy it. And that was a powerful stimulant. So I think I agree with Linda. It's throwing money at problems is not enough. But historically also, government's role has not simply been to fund research. That if you look at, for example, procurement by the government, that's been a very significant component of how the innovation ecosystem worked. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to take the long view to sort of provide some context. Over the last 30, 35 years, our innovation ecosystem has changed quite dramatically. Not suddenly, but if you look at it over the 35, 40-year period, it's been a very stark change. We've moved from a system where large corporate labs were the main locus for significant new innovations. So think about Bell Labs, IBM, DuPont, GE, Exxon. Those were the sources of innovation. We've moved now to a much more decentralized, fragmented system, which you can think of as there's more specialization, more division of labor. Again, going back to COVID, think about BioNTech, the German firm, and Pfizer, right? The vaccine is the result of collaboration between those two. That's the new system. In the old world, it would have just been a Pfizer or a Merck or something like that. So we have this new system. I think it's working really well in particular sectors like pharmaceuticals, life sciences, and I would say in digital. But this new system is unbalanced in two important ways. And I think I'll come to sort of Linda's point. And I think that those imbalances is the place where the government comes in. And let me just tell you what those imbalances are. One is, I think, that the corporate labs played a very important role in the innovation system. But second, if you look in terms of sectors, we have an imbalance. If you think about materials, if you think about carbon sequestration, if you think about energy storage, those kinds of sectors are not getting the attention that they need. And it's not just a matter of money. I think something more has to be done. So let me stop here.
Those are good points. And Kaye, let me follow up with you, because I know you talked about, when we talked, you talked about the problems of silos and thinking about new ways of doing things. And Ashish is saying that it's becoming more decentralized. Do you think that's moving in the right direction away from silos, or do you see it as still too siloed?
I think that his point is about more decentralized in terms of not just the big labs. In fact, side note, Bell Labs paid for me to go to grad school, and I spent some time at Murray Hill and at Homedale, and I understand how that progression was so essential then to some of the technologies that we take for granted today. So, but the other part of what he's saying, though, is that how the work gets done and where the work gets done is now more distributed, and I think that's okay. But the collaboration among agencies is what I was also talking about, that this R&D spending, as it goes to various science agencies, if those agencies continue to work in silos in a way that you're tackling some of the same problems, but not able to collaborate, I perceive that as a problem. So my notes to myself here about this question really revolved around something that Ashish mentioned, which are, what are the big issues? What are the big problems that we're trying to tackle? And some of those are very long-term problems, not just we've been working on them for a long time, but we will be working on them in the future. And what kind of talent do we need to bring to forward for these issues to be tackled in a robust fashion? And that's where that collaboration needs to occur, especially among science agencies. Let me just throw out a few of those items. We talked about public health and healthcare already a little bit. Environment and climate change, that's important as well, where you can't just say the Department of Energy is the only one that's going to work on this, right? Food and water security, so that's an important piece. Energy production, utilization, and storage. We're focused on bigger picture issues of well-being, which cannot just be siloed or distributed if we're going to work on that. National security, of course. And the other item that I want to put here, which is kind of very different than what we used to talk about, but when we're looking at R&D spending in these agencies, having a robust data infrastructure to really understand how better to fund science, I think that's very important. Later on, I'll talk a little bit about some more, but I'll leave it there. So I'm not really disagreeing with Ashish at all. I just see what he's saying about the distributed factors, just not kind of all concentrated in the big labs or such. But I also do think that some collaboration among, especially the science agencies that will be funded in USICA or other bills, I think that's really essential also to tackle these big problems.
So there are a bunch of things I want to come back to in a bit here. But Linda, what do you think about you've studied the big labs, but you've also, at least you said, that some of the newer ones that are doing good work are more specialized, ARPA-E.
Oh, okay, so you brought up the ARPA programs. It's actually a slightly different program, but it relates directly to what we were just hearing about. DARPA is very often held up as this model of what government can do when it has freedom, when it can make decisions, it can take high risks. And there's certainly been some really interesting technologies that have come out of it over its many years. And so the idea of trying to extend that to other agencies became popular. I think the first one that went in was ARPA. Do I have that right? Okay, so the idea of extending the ARPA model to other research programs in the federal government took off about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago. And the one that has maybe gotten the most press since then is ARPA-E, which is the Department of Energy has put this together. And the recent bills that are now up before Congress talk about establishing an ARPA-H for NIH. And there's also ARPA-I, which is going to be for infrastructure, so that would be in the Department of Transportation. So the idea of these models, I mean, if you look at what they say, it's all this high-risk, revolutionary technology. It's supposed to be something that's really disruptive. It's supposed to be money that, as I was saying, is both research. I mean, this was DARPA's idea, was that it cut through the silos at the Department of Defense between basic research and applied research. And that's what ARPA-E has tried very hard to do, because I haven't seen anything that really helps silos between agencies. That seems to be a step too far. But at least within some of these agencies, they're trying to get through some of the silos within the agencies, which are extraordinary. Certainly at the Department of Energy, it's very difficult to do something between energy, renewable energy, say, and basic sciences. It's just totally separate. So that's what ARPA-E has tried to do, and it's been around now for some 10 years, and it's being extended. They have very different models, and I want to throw this out because, at least for the academics here, you might take note. The ARPA models don't involve peer review. So implementing this at NIH would be a real change. The ARPA models all have an administrator who's supposed to be really smart and is picking good projects. So it's an interesting model. ARPA-E has actually done a lot of work in storage, so they've managed to get through that problem of who does materials in the Department of Energy that has to do with energy. But it very much relies on having a Nobel laureate at the head of the agency who brings his friend in. I mean, it's a very special, I feel very nervous at the idea of an agency that relies on a smart person being there to be successful. I'll stop there.
What qualifications do you think a person should have?
Well, DARPA has managed this over the years, and this gets back to something Ashish was saying. This is a very long-term project. They've been working on this stuff for 50 years. And an awful lot of their really successful things you can see, look back and see stuff that was going on a very long time ago, which makes, I think, in your list of questions that you sent to us earlier, you said something about how do we evaluate it.
Yep.
And it's very hard to evaluate.
It's also one of the questions here in Slido that we're going to
It's coming up. So where were we?
How do you, why wouldn't you want a smart person as head of the?
Oh, you want a smart person as head. How do you get a smart person as head? So what DARPA has done is they bring in academics for 5 years. And I guess, the idea that you can go work, here's $20 billion, have fun, that's a fairly, interesting brief to have for 5 years. They rotate people in and out. And actually, this is another government bureaucratic issue that they've tried to deal with at ARPA, which is, can you hire people for these positions outside government hiring? Outside not just the civil service, but also the salary kinds of things. And DARPA has pulled that off, and that's what the other ARPA models are going to be. So I don't know how that'll extend.
So I don't want to mix up the topics too much, but I want to come back to the ARPA-I because it sounds like that's something that might affect the industries of a lot of people here, an organization working on innovation and infrastructure. But I want to go to Prem because you are at the, I guess where the rubber hits the road here. How do we bring this research to consumers, to people? And you've been, and you've seen it from the university side and now from the corporate side. How do all these institutions come together?
Yeah, thanks. Let me try to first frame how I see this overall thing and make the connection from where we were talking about to where you're headed with this question. So overall, I think the aspiration of societal investments, whether it's individual or collective, into science is both to make fundamental discoveries, gain new insights, but then to translate those discoveries and insights into technologies or capabilities or processes or systems that benefit all of us, right? And so, and there have been different models at how to do this. So I think we started off with what I would call a completely factored model, where there were different sectors in society that addressed these different aspirations. I mean, I just gave you two points on the spectrum, but there's clearly a continuum in between, and there were different sectors. So, for example, academia was focused largely at one point on fundamental science, and, et cetera. And at the other end, industry was very much focused on engineering the best experiences, the best products, capabilities out to customers, building upon those advances. Within that context, the government funding itself, I think, has evolved. I've benefited a lot from a DARPA investment. I was principal for more than 20 years. I was a PI on substantial DARPA and IARPA projects. And actually, by the way, the second ARPA was actually Homeland Security ARPA, HS-ARPA.
Yeah.
IARPA was the third. But IARPA, I think, is the most successful or like most well-known next ARPA, after which I would put ARPA-E. Now, organizations like NSF, their stated mission is curiosity-driven research, which is to advance our state of the understanding of the world through investigation of phenomena that we all observe and understand why those phenomena are happening. And that could be in the social sciences, that could be in the physical world. An organization like DARPA had what I would say mission-focused research, where there was a problem or a set of problems that were framed. In that context, I'd say DARPA program managers actually had to synthesize both requirements from user communities. They had to talk with the folks who might end up using these technologies and understand what are the real problems that they're facing that require invention to solve or to provide. And then they also synthesized kind of the state of the art and understanding of the state of the art through engagements with academia, through engagements with research labs, and then formulate a program and then make very focused investments in solving specific kinds of science problems. Very clearly, crisply framed science problems that then are optimized to deliver the outcomes that you want. Now, having said that, so what I see now is that over the last maybe 20, 25 years, there's been a steady blending of these different sectors and how they're coming together. And I think the forward-looking funding landscape actually reflects that emerging social consensus, which is just happening around how this funding happens. So, for example, the Bayh-Dole Act, I think, put a lot of IP in the universities. And so that made universities focus on generating IP, which is more tangible than just discoveries or insights that are leveraged by others. There's been closer work between academia and industry over the last 20, 25 years. I think we're seeing a reflection of that in some of this funding, which is that the government is saying, gee, we have these kind of silos, fundamental research, somewhat mission-driven research, very applied research, maybe these are the services labs, et cetera. We need to follow the thing that we're seeing in society through a multi-sector approach where everything is singing as part of the same orchestra. And so that's why I think we're seeing partly greater investment in translational research into NSF, which will bring, I think, NSF and DARPA models a little bit closer to each other. I mean, obviously, they're very different models. And even in the context of reviews of these proposals, it may not be peer review at the ARPA, ex-ARPA agencies, but it is committee review. I mean, there are people who are experts both in technology and in the use cases who are looking to see, is this the kind of research that is likely to give us the kind of outcomes that we want? The last point then is, where are we today in terms of you asked rubber hitting the road. I think what we're finding out is that this kind of layering of like closer to fundamental research and all the way to translation research, I think it's actually happening both at the structured level, but also at the individual lab levels, because what's happening is as we're putting out more technologies out into the field, we're discovering new problems that need to be solved in order to make those technologies really scalable or really adaptable or really available to everyone that the aspiration is to be universally available. Those new invention problems require a multi-sector participation, but they also require expertise within the labs. So we're all building science capacity or invention capacity in our own organizations, both to be able to solve what you might not necessarily the last mile science problem, but maybe the last 3-4 mile science problems, but also to be able to articulate some of those problems to our partners in the other sectors. I really believe some of the hardest problems that we look ahead at in science and technology are only solvable through a multi-sector partnership. And that means the role of the government is to be an enabler and a facilitator and an investor in creating the best multi-sector partnership the world has ever seen. And I think as the US, we have a chance to lead in that way and say it's not just central, but it's this multi-sector partnership where all of society is resourced and harnessed into making these advances.
So Kaye, this is similar to something that you had said, questioning whether we should reform our institutions and so on. But just before we get to that, I just want to follow up with Prem on one of the things you said. The broad question of who does what kind of research. But at Amazon, how do you all decide what you're going to work on? Do you sit down and think, no, this is something that the government should be working on, or the government is working on, so we're not going to waste our resources on that? Or, oh my God, we've got to do this before the government does. How do you make those decisions?
So one of the interesting simplifiers we have Michael, is in figuring out what is the best way to accelerate the benefit to the customer. So all of our investments the simplifying filter that we use is how can our investments provide the best additional value to the customer, either by accelerating advances to the customer or by creating new advances that we want to put out to the customer. So that's the filter we use. And we certainly don't see this as like a one-upmanship at all. In fact, we constantly survey the horizon to see what are the advances, what are the emerging breakthroughs, and how might those translate into services, processes, capabilities that we can deliver to our customers and end users. So our investments are focused on that, like how to translate this and then how to fill the gaps that we're seeing in the rest of the infrastructure. Like, let me take a simple example. Like, we wanted to create a framework in which anybody who wants to create a voice user experience can create a voice user experience. Right? In some ways you can call it the democratization of AI, but maybe in a technical term, it's about low code and no code development focused on AI. So we launched this thing called Alexa Conversations, which is a developer framework that allows people to develop complex, satisfying multi-turn experiences with way less effort and by bringing way less data to the table than you traditionally had to in conversational AI. And that also created a bunch of science challenges. How do you create models that deliver good performance with very little data? So now that becomes a machine learning research problem that we have to invest in and advance machine learning towards enabling that capability. But then there's a bunch of things happening in the rest of the world, like pre-trained models or few-shot and zero-shot learning advances coming from academia that we say, oh, these are providing us insights into techniques we should explore further. So we build on those too.
Okay, so now, Kaye, I mean, when we chatted, you were sort of musing on what are different ways that this whole system could be reorganized, and whether the institutions need to be reformed. So how do you think about that? How do you follow up on what Prem was saying, the interaction of these agencies?
Well, that's a big question.
Yeah, I have no idea.
A lot of what Prem was saying also, I really like the way he said, we think of the creative side or the discovery side as the fundamental science that oftentimes you see funded by the agencies that occurs oftentimes at universities. But then, Venki Narma, from Harvard, he has a book from a few years ago where he says, but a lot of this discovery is also happening in the engineering processes at companies where they come to a problem and they say, oh, we have to discover, how we're going to solve that. And discovery science is just not a linear process. It's not just going to happen outside the company and then the company is going to deploy something. So I think that that's what Ashish and Prem have also been saying here is really important. So therefore, where does that funding go from the government and where does the science happen? A lot of what I'm hearing and a lot of what I see here at Georgia Tech is that the companies are also trying to get very close to the universities, even in terms of proximity, because they want access to talent. And so I just wanted to put that on the table, that the talent access is also really important because not only do you need to know what the customers need and what's the pickup of the new technology, how will it be adapted and utilized by the customers, but some of that ingenuity is going to come from sheer talent that exists. The graduate students, sometimes the undergraduate students, obviously the faculty that exists at these universities, and that's all part of this flow, and it's not linear at all. And so, Scott, what I also feel that I want to add to this conversation is that when we're talking about access to talent, and I think Prem mentioned for all, I think it's really important that this be access for all types of individuals that are in the STEM field and non-STEM fields, because behavioral science is really important to the machine learning tools and the AI tools. It's not just the computing side that's important here. So I just made a stew, right? I just made this into a little bit more complex than the usual linear process. But I think to get after these big, high-level problems that I tried to outline earlier, these existential issues that we all are trying to get after, the reason why translation science and why use-based science is important, combined with the curiosity-driven science, I think it is that complex. And then one of the factors that really is important is this access to talent and access to knowledge. And that can be at the universities, certainly in the private sector, but I also think that the government sector and the funding, that we're describing here, funding of R&D, is an essential lever, if you will, to ensure that that continues, that happens. But I want to also stress that it has to happen in a distributed form, not just for the usual folks that are in these fields, but also for all, including STEM adjacent and behavioral and social science as well. I hope that answers your question, because it's a big, big, big question. So I just tried to take a part of it and say, not a linear model, it's certainly something where, I agree with everything that was said, but I just wanted to put one more thing on the table to say, the funding of talent through these agencies is an essential part of this, and it has to be funding for all.
So is that sort of three related things with talent? I mean, one is that, and if I don't want to be putting words in your mouth, so I might be saying something completely wrong, but that building up talent is not particularly well integrated into what the agencies do. To the extent that it is, it's not well distributed across different types of fields, professions, and people. Right. Yeah. So I guess two. I mean, are those the problems, that they don't think about it enough to begin with, and then when they do, that they're not broad enough?
I would say it's the second, not the first. I mean, a lot of what NSF, I was a rotator at NSF, I'm still on some of their committees. So, funding talent is essential there, is really important. I was on another committee at National Institutes of Health, and we talked a lot about, well, how do we get the funding to labs and ensure that those labs are diverse and all of that. So I wouldn't go to the first part and say that the agencies are not funding talent. They're definitely funding talent, but it's how distributed that talent is and who is in the sphere really matters. And I think Prem can say he sees it in his products, in the output side, depending on who's actually doing the thinking and the production, can determine what these outputs look like. So I think that part is really essential as well. I was reading in preparation for this, and I saw something even that said R2 universities need to develop centers of excellence in subfields that are linked to their existing strengths. We shouldn't just be funding just the research part, but the training part is also important, and retraining, and everyone talks about the future of work. So I think that it's that second part that I want to lean into a bit more, because more can be done.
Can I ask a question here? This brings up something way afield of our panel, so cut me off if you want. A couple of years ago, I think it was the National Academy came up with a report about the problems of women, minorities, sort of the inclusivity, diversity of the graduate student population in the United States, and how the universities did that. And if I recall correctly, one of their really interesting conclusions was that the way that the funding was done, the way that it came through agencies to labs, was really problematic. That what it did was it put the professors in charge of the money and deciding who they were going to fund. It gave the professors far too much power, especially with respect. I mean, what they were really looking at was female graduate students was their issue. And they called for rethinking the whole way that was done. How did that play at Georgia? I mean, it was a real, it seemed to me that it really criticized the structure that we have in the United States of thinking about funding the next generation of scientists.
Yeah, I see your point, and there are a number of studies at the academies. Another thing I did was rotator at the National Academies on a different project as well. And so certainly it's not done. That's why I said the second part of it, is it done well? No. But it would be hard, I would be hard pressed to say that NSF, NIH, DOE, DOD, that they don't fund talent, because a lot of what funding goes for are the graduate students, et cetera. But the distribution of it and who is included and who's not included, I certainly know that, there are a number of studies, that academy studies and others, some of the stuff that I've worked on as well, that show that there is, it really is sometimes to a degree shameful, who's funded and who's not. I'm an economist by training, and I have these statistics that I like to tell. NCSES and the National Science Foundation has these statistics. So for PhDs in economics, in 2018, about 1,300 were minted. For female economists in 2018, 427. For African American economists in 2018, minted that year, 21. So yeah, and I have a degree in mathematics too, the same numbers for math are 2,563 and 31. So right, we're not seeing that production in fields that are STEM at all, and therefore that speaks to who's included in these research projects, and therefore you can back that up into who's funded. And so a lot more needs to be done, but don't want to just focus on the graduate students or the PhD students, because we all know that a number of individuals who are at the master's level or trainees even in STEM and STEM adjacent fields could surely benefit from the funding to ensure that this is a much more robust R&D sector in the United States.
Ashish, does this fit into part of is this among the imbalances that you were talking about, and ways that things that should be reformed?
So actually, I wasn't, but this is a really important point. But let me build on one thing that Kaye said, and I think Prem was alluding to. My late PhD thesis advisor, Nate Rosenberg, used to say, every economic policy is innovation policy. So one of the problems when we start thinking about innovation is we start thinking about funding and government, money to this, that, and the other. But at least if you take the long view, things that are happening in the marketplace are at least as important as the money that gets put in. I would say at least as important. And so if we think about the issues Kaye was raising, I think it's both a supply, it's definitely a supply side question. And we have to think about how to get there. But the imbalances I was thinking about in terms of sectors were much more if you think across technologies. So if you think about America, we do really well in digital stuff and in life sciences. And if you think about some of the existential problems we face, I would say this new system with what Prem was calling these sort of multi-factor or different sectors collaborating, I think this new system is not doing well at that. In new materials, if IBM and Intel pull out of new semiconducting materials, and for all I know they have, I don't know where we're going to get that from. Yeah, maybe the labs will, the national labs might do something, but I really worry that, so that's, that's an example of the imbalance. So if you think about where R&D funding is going to go, one of the things we have to think about is ensuring that the sectoral balance, and I'm thinking about technology sectors, is maintained. And just to go back to my first point, we also have to think about demand side policies to pull those investments through. It's no point funding a lot of chemical engineers or chemical engineering PhDs if they can't get jobs, right? Or polymer scientists or material scientists. So we need to make sure somehow that system, that balance is maintained.
So that, I mean, thinking about what we're missing and asking where we'll get it from comes to the question of cross-country scientific collaboration, for example. And we do a lot of scientific work with China, which is becoming more and more difficult, right? And everybody benefits from the research everyone does everywhere else. But and we'll have a panel on China later, but is this decoupling part of the problem, making things worse? Not saying that any of the reasons for it are wrong, or that things China does are good, but this is an issue. We do a lot of work with China. What happens when we do less?
Kaye is the policy expert. I'll let her take this.
Oh boy, I'm gonna put myself out there. So this is the beginning of the conversation. So I'm on. Just finished up a study. I was on a committee at the American Academies that did a study on large-scale science, and you have seen that report. It came out earlier this year. One of the things that we focused on was when you're looking at large-scale science, CERN, et cetera, you have to think that science does not begin and end at a border. We need to have the best talent on problems across the board. But we also cannot be naive about where, risks exist. And so I actually, in response to this question, I just want to read a very short clip, if you will, if you allow me, from that report about exactly this issue. It says, the United States cannot afford to ignore China's emergence as a leading investor with an impressive national research enterprise. It is vital that the United States not be caught by surprise by major advances that are made in China. If the U.S. puts its curtains up, China will as well. The U.S. intelligence community has indicated, however, that China is using some of its collaborations in national studies to gain on the U.S., basically, in terms of intellectual property, et cetera. And so the U.S. I'm paraphrasing here, the scientific community in the U.S. Really needs to be cognizant of what those things are and take the precautions it needs to. But nevertheless, I mean, our activities in large-scale science, our activities on our own campus, we need to be inclusive in terms of nationals from anywhere. But we also have to be really cognizant of the risks and put, governance in place to ensure that we are very careful. And threading that needle is hard. And I don't presume to have the best answers to that one. Maybe other panelists on this, others on this panel and others will have a better answer. But the bottom line is that kind of collaboration on science doesn't stop at a border. And we have to think about, how to be more inclusive, but also to mitigate against risks.
But may I ask a question?
Please.
Yeah. I was listening to Ashish and Kaye, and I was wondering whether Ashish would agree that this, you were talking about the sectoral imbalance, and sort of within maybe a national economy, even a sophisticated national economy like the U.S. Has sectoral imbalances. But this question, Scott, made me wonder whether we also have a global sectoral. In a sense, my instinct is the world is a very large place. There's so many people to work with. 8 billion plus and growing. And then, so the fact that there's a question such as this one that is focused on one part of the world makes me wonder whether it is reflective of that kind of imbalance at a global scale where there is that dependency where instead of us saying the world is a large place and we want to be inclusive, we want to work with so many people, and there's talent all around the world. There's South America, there's Africa, there's Southeast Asia. There's so much more to build. What's your, it's not my area of expertise, but one has questions even outside one's areas of expertise. And so this was, as I was listening to Ashish and Kaye, this thought came to me and I just thought maybe I could ask you.
In the energy field, especially talking about clean energy, you can see innovation sort of hopping around the world. And I would have to say it's really fortunate because energy policy in the United States, innovation policy in energy, has waxed and waned in a dramatic way and not to the benefit of innovation. So, we sort of do renewable energy and then a new administration comes in and cuts that completely and starts doing something else. And this has been going on since the 1970s. Fortunately for both solar and wind, during some of these, low periods, it has been taken up by other countries. The comment that Ashish made about demand, I think, is absolutely critical here. Germany, people were making fun of Germany for a while because they were paying so much for solar panels. And anyway, how many Germans are here? There's not a lot of sun there, so why are they putting up all these solar panels? But it made a huge difference in innovation in that area to have that kind of demand pull over this period of time. So it's, the idea that politically, it's an enormous benefit that there's more than one administration making decisions about what to invest in these critical areas, I would say.
We'll start taking questions live questions from the audience in a second. So if you have some, start thinking about them. So I don't know if we know much about this. I said I would ask about ARPA-I. What do we know about this? Should people here from ISPs be thinking, "Holy crap," or should they be excited by it?
It's still just a vision in Pete Buttigieg's head, right? I mean, it's part of the infrastructure bill is going to be a couple $2 billion for something. And I think that maybe people should be thinking about it because there might be an opportunity to define what that something is. So it'll be a few $1 billion if it gets through this year.
I'll ask some of these questions. Okay, this is a softball, but I'll allow it because I love technology. I always think it's cool. So R&D on AI and machine learning seems to have dramatically improved natural language recognition. And how is that being implemented to improve people's lives? I would assume this is being directed at Prem. And so tell us about all that cool stuff.
Yeah. So, people's lives are, our goal, our mission is to deliver maximum everyday convenience and daily value to people's lives in translating R&D both done by us and what we see as interesting around the world into capabilities. But part of how you create this innovation and how that R&D is applied is by bringing in a worldwide community of developers who then take the technology and provide services or experiences that reflect the needs of many different user groups or user cohorts. A couple of examples that I feel particularly satisfied by that are not the result, obviously, of central planning or a mission. One is how conversational AI, but Alexa in particular, has been leveraged for education in India. So you can go online and search about this. It was all started by a simple, innovative idea from a school teacher in a rural part of Maharashtra, the state that I come from in India, that I grew up in India. He had this idea of bringing in Alexa as a way of improving certain kinds of education for students and also creating an incentive for people to practice how to speak and sort of an intuitive recognition that technology provides a different form of stimulation for the inquisitive mind. And before we knew it, we saw like this thing was getting a lot of notice. So we then started saying, okay, let us invest. So we started providing devices and other kinds of support, maybe even adding new technology to accelerate this usage. And now it's become kind of a broader based program in some parts of India, especially in the rural areas where educational infrastructure is kind of limited in certain ways. And this can provide a bit of an equalizing effect or more opportunity. So that's one thing that I found super satisfying. A second thing that I've been personally satisfied by are the ways in which people whose mobility might be limited or whose access to everything else that the rest of us take granted for in our lives every day, like locking a door or closing a garage door, or even making a call, or reaching out to somebody when you need a help, like you've had a fall and you want to reach out to somebody for help and you're not able to move or access some other static communication asset. Each of these, just do a search, a web search, and you'll find so reference to some of the stories I'm talking about. So synthesizing all of that, I'd say the way in which we see these advances benefiting people is both through the services and capabilities we launch, but even more importantly in my mind, through the services and capabilities and experiences that we enable developer partners to launch. And we have tens of thousands of developers on Alexa who are not Amazon developers who are developing their own experiences. So personally for me, an important science mission is how to keep improving the developer frameworks so that the worldwide community, both developers, experienced developers, but also people without much experience in software or AI, can create and launch experiences that benefit people. And that's how we will harness all the advances of this R&D into new experiences and benefits for people worldwide.
Okay. Any questions from out here? Yeah, great. And there's the microphone. Excellent.
Thank you for the panel today. You mentioned the ARPA examples and the offshoots. I'm just kind of curious with DARPA, it's a defense initiative. U.S. defense funding is generally very high, and the whole premise is U.S. needs to be the leader. So I'm kind of curious with these other industries, there's obviously a greater role for the private sector innovation, and private sector probably outpaces the government in a lot of ways. So I'm kind of curious how you can apply that DARPA model to these other industries where inherently the private sector has to collaborate more. I'm just kind of curious how you see that playing out.
Well, the private sector obviously is very involved in DARPA. Okay, they're providing the technology. But a couple of big points there. The Defense Department is buying the technology if it works out. So you've got this demand side baked in, if it works. And that is obviously problematic in the other ARPAs, unless they're also dealing in some way with a government purchase at the end of it, which is one way you could think about the vaccine initiative, right? Which, I mean, that didn't come out of an ARPA, but there was a government purchase. And in the energy area, sometimes you can basically get that if you have a regulated electricity sector. Now, as the electricity sector becomes more restructured, this becomes actually more problematic. And we've seen that in some areas. And how it works out in some of the other ARPAs, I couldn't tell you, as they get more and more towards industries that are more and more competitive, where there's private industry is really going to be calling the shots, really in between consumers and the product. I think it's problematic. Another issue about DARPA is the defense budget is huge, and the DARPA budget is just round-off error. It was a lot of money, but nobody even noticed it for years. And then it went on for years. And I think that's the third point that's really important about DARPA, because these technologies, the fundamentals of the technology take so long to come up. And then all of a sudden you see, bang, you've got a vaccine, right? But there's such background to it. And whether these new ARPAs can keep that kind of, can keep it going for that long, we don't have other examples in government of that kind of persistence. So I do think that, it's pretty dicey. On the other hand, the idea of trying to break through the bureaucracy in these agencies, which are largely set up to have a science division and an applications and so on, catering to different lobbying groups. Maybe in energy, there's fossil energy and renewable energy, and they're totally separate, right? That if ARPA-E can break through that and write contracts in a different way with industry and with universities, which the regular part of DOE can't because of the various contract requirements, the IP requirements. I mean, there's sort of a huge amount of bureaucracy in that agency. I don't know the other agencies particularly. What I've read about ARPA-H is that's what they're going to try to do at NIH. They obviously do plenty of translational research, plenty of applied research at NIH, but they seem to think that they have this same issue. And if it gives them a mechanism for kind of reorganizing within the agency, it may be quite valuable anyway. I don't see them becoming DARPAs. I don't know.
I think with that, we're going to actually have to wrap it up. I want to make sure to keep everything on time. Thank you so much to our panelists. I appreciate you joining from all the places you are, and Linda from joining right here, and from coming to California, of course. Oregon, you were, I believe. It was a great discussion. I think it was nuanced, and you prevented me from asking my last question, which was going to be incredibly simplistic, so better that I didn't. Thank you all so much, and let's move on to the antitrust panel. Thanks.
Okay.